Welcome back to Mark Carney's book club. This is the second part of chapter 10. We're talking about the COVID pandemic and what the COVID pandemic exposed to us about our values as a society. We're talking about fairness in an unequal society and how the pandemic affected different groups differently. We talked about the racial disparities and how the COVID-19 pandemic affected people of color much more than white people, and he shared stats about that. Now he's going to talk about education. And so education under lockdown depended heavily on parental guidance and access to a computer and high-speed internet, which reinforced the structural advantages of children coming from high-income households. The UN estimated that half of the 1.5 billion children out of school did not have access to a computer. Statistics Norway has estimated that school closures cost $173 per child per day in lost future earnings and lost parental productivity. The end result is that the young, who are much less affected by the disease directly, will likely pay a significant part of the economic price of the pandemic, even before taking into consideration the possibility of higher taxes over their lifetimes to fund current emergency response measures. He's now going to go through a framework for the common good under COVID. He starts by saying, given the lack of preparations and the slow initial responses to the developing COVID pandemic, by the time most governments acted, they had no choice but to close their economies. It was paramount to reverse what was becoming an explosive contagion of the disease with dire consequences for mortality and human dignity. While it would have been better to have acted earlier, and it would have been even better to prepare well in advance, the decisions to lock down were literally the only viable options by the time they were finally taken. Once you close down an economy, how do you reopen it again and when? And that is what he describes next when he says, the framing of the reopening problem demonstrates in the starkest terms the importance of understanding the relationship between value and values. As we have seen, there are ways to make this a clinical decision. The combination of valuing techniques such as value of statistical life and tools for decision-making, such as cost-benefit analysis, can allow policymakers to weigh the current and potential future economic damage against the estimated monetary costs of increased morbidity until, consistent with the marginal revolution discussed in Chapter 2, the marginal costs and benefits of death and commerce are equalized. Such analysis can be made more sophisticated by including estimates of the costs of the lockdown on mental health and foregone education, as well as the estimates of the benefits of reopening in terms of maintaining the skills of workers and the productive capacity of firms. Such an approach, however, would have flown in the face of the revealed preference of people who, when faced with the prospect of a COVID onslaught, largely embraced efforts to protect the greatest number of their fellow citizens. He describes an approach called the cost effectiveness analysis by economists Tim Besley and Nick Stein. The goals are based on society's values first, with a clear indicator and measure of the goals established. For COVID, the goal would be for a low transmission rate. Cost effectiveness analysis seeks to achieve society's values. In the wrong hands, cost-benefit analysis can determine them. As the weeks turned to months, 4 things changed. First, progress was made containing but not eradicating the disease, with the rate of propagation falling below 1. Second, the economic costs began to mount considerably, with government deficits reaching levels not seen since the heights of the Second World War. Third, prolonged inactivity began to erode the productive capacities of workers in many companies. These were spread increasingly unevenly across the economy. Finally, the unequal impacts of the pandemic on different socioeconomic groups, women, minorities, and the young, and on the broader health of the population, including mental health, domestic abuse, and the non-treatment of other diseases, became increasingly apparent. So this environment called for more explicit trade-offs between health and economic costs, and although economic and health objectives are often placed in opposition, the reality is more complex. For example, data from various countries indicate that more than 80% of reduction in mobility are voluntarily as the prevalence of the virus increases. People won't necessarily come back to work or go out to spend if they are concerned about their health, so the demand and supply impacts of lifting lockdown measures prematurely will be limited. People are less likely to spend on entertainment if they fear higher risks of infection. Surges in infection rates undermine consumer and market confidence. In addition, the prospect of successive waves of the disease will be more damaging to confidence if people believe that they have been sold false promises of a return towards normality. This underscores the important, clear, and frank communications about what is and isn't known about the disease and its propagation. The challenge for policy is to minimize the economic costs of keeping the infection rates under control while paying due consideration to issues of distributional and intergenerational equity. Forfeiting children's education or crippling the future productive potential of the economy would appear too high a price for annihilation of the disease. In other words, equality and dynamism should be added to the values guiding COVID policy decisions. He then goes into deciding which sectors of the economy to open and close and weighs various factors that are not valued in any market. And the biggest challenges are in the area that are essential economically, but also highly risky from an infection perspective, such as healthcare, essential travel, and education. These additional complexities mean that COVID decision-making cannot be reduced to the optimization of the mathematical expectation to some objective function. The nature of uncertainties, the magnitude of consequences, and possible disagreement over values are such that policymakers should choose actions that are robust in the sense that they perform reasonably well relative to other policies over a range of possible scenarios. The ideal would be no regret policies, but given the fog of COVID, the best we can hope for is probably low regret ones. He stresses that fairness in access to healthcare is essential, and if it is compromised, the bounds between legitimacy of the state and reciprocity of citizens will be undermined, so feeding back into the lower compliance and worse health and economic outcomes. The same goes for perceived fairness and privations experienced during lockdowns and social distancing. There cannot be one rule for the powerful and another for the rest, as the public outrage over behavior during the lockdown of senior government officials and footballers attests. COVID crisis revealed the importance of the state and the costs of its failures. People rose to the occasion, displaying solidarity and altruism. At the same time, the crisis has revealed deep strains and injustices. Essential workers have been undervalued, and the contrast between the solidarity with their fellow citizens that so many displayed and the deep inequalities that exist in society is stark. This has rightly raised expectations for fairness and greater equality in all spheres of life. The question is whether the values revealed during the crisis will be lived in normal times. It will depend in part how value changes in the post-COVID world. Financial market valuations have oscillated with changing perceptions of the length and severity of the pandemic. Deeper concerns include the extent to which economies are experiencing supply destruction rather than mere disruption. In concrete terms, how many once viable companies will be permanently impaired, and how many people will lose their jobs and their attachment to the labor force? The answers to these questions, more than the scale of any short-term moves in GDP, will be the true test of the effectiveness of the responses of governments, companies, and banks. It also mentions opportunities that arose from the crisis, like advanced teleworking, e-health, and distance learning. And I'm going to take the opportunity to plug an amazing company that arose from COVID, which is Health Clinic Canada, helpclinic.ca. You can go there if you're Canadian and be matched with a therapist that you can see virtually. There are good things that did come of it, and we did change the way we do a lot of things. People's economic narratives have changed. After decades of risk being steadily downloaded onto individuals, the bill has arrived and people cannot even begin to pay it. Entire populations have experienced the fears of the unemployed and sense the anxieties that come with inadequate or inaccessible healthcare. The crisis has been a test of stakeholder capitalism. When it's over, companies will be judged by what they did during the war, how they treated their employees, suppliers, and customers, who shared and who hoarded, who stepped up and who stood down. Next, Chapter 11, we're going to dive into climate change. Stay tuned for that.